Last summer, I decided to go on a solo camping trip. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but it was my first time at this particular state park. I had heard it was peaceful, with great trails and secluded spots where you could really feel like you were away from the world. That's exactly what I wanted. The first day was perfect. I set up my tent near a small creek, had a simple dinner by the fire, and just soaked in the quiet. There were a few other campers scattered throughout the area, but no one was close enough to really see or hear. It felt like I had the woods to myself. By nightfall, I was in my tent, reading a book by flashlight, when I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal. It wouldn't be unusual for a raccoon or deer to wander by, so I didn't think much of it. But then the footsteps stopped right by my tent. I froze, listening. Whoever it was wasn't moving, just standing there. I called out, asking if someone needed help. No one answered, but the footsteps started again, this time circling the tent. I told myself it had to be another camper who had gotten lost, or maybe even a park ranger doing a check. But something about it felt off. Most people would announce themselves or respond when someone called out, right? I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was still glowing faintly, casting enough light to see that there was no one there. The footsteps had stopped, but I didn't hear anyone walking away either. It was like they had just vanished. I sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Eventually, I crawled back into the tent and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt around my tent. They weren't mine, and they weren't mine. They weren't from an animal. They were from Boots' large ones. I decided to stay one more night, reasoning that whoever it was had probably just been passing through. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling, especially as the day went on, and I kept noticing small things out of place. My water bottle, which I was sure I'd left on the picnic table, was on the ground. A stick I'd propped up by the fire pit was now leaning against a tree. They were little things, but they added up. That night I didn't even try to sleep. I sat by the fire with my flashlight and a camping knife, listening to every rustle and crack in the woods. Around midnight I heard the footsteps again. This time they didn't stop at the tent. They stayed just out of the firelight, moving back and forth, slow and deliberate, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I called out, saying that I had a knife and wasn't afraid to use it. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and left. On my way out, I stopped at the ranger station to report what had happened. They didn't seem too concerned, saying it was probably just another camper messing around or maybe someone from a nearby property. But here's the thing, when I got home and checked the reviews for that campsite, I found several stories from other campers who had experienced similar things. Footsteps at night, items moved or missing, and a feeling of being watched. I haven't been camping since. I keep telling myself I'll go again someday, but the thought of being out there, alone in the woods, knowing that someone might be watching, it's enough to keep me home for now. Last fall, a group of friends and I planned a weekend hiking trip in the mountains. It wasn't anything too extreme. We wanted to get out, enjoy the crisp autumn air, and see the leaves changing colors. There were 6 of us, and we picked a well-known trail that led to a picturesque overlook. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing trip. The first day went smoothly. We set up camp in a clearing just off the trail, cooked dinner over a small fire, and spent the evening laughing and telling stories. It was one of those nights where everything feels right. The next morning, we packed up most of our gear and decided to hike a bit farther up the trail. We left the tents and heavier items behind, figuring we'd circle back by the afternoon. About an hour into the hike, we noticed someone following us. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. The trail was public, and it wasn't unusual to see other hikers. But this person didn't look like a typical hiker. They were dressed in dark clothes, not the kind of gear you'd expect for a hike. No backpack, no visible water bottle, just a black hoodie and jeans. They stayed far enough behind that we couldn't make out their face, but they didn't try to pass us or engage in any way. They just lingered. One of my friends joked that it was probably a lost goth kid trying to find their way back to civilization, and we all laughed it off. But as the hours went by, the stranger stayed with us. Not close enough to be part of our group, but not far enough to seem like they were just minding their own business. It started to feel less like a coincidence and more like they were deliberately keeping pace with us. We decided to take a break at a small clearing off the trail, partly to rest and partly to see if the person would pass us. They didn't. Instead, they stopped on the trail, standing just out of sight. We could hear their footsteps stop, and when we looked back, we could see the faint outline of their figure through the trees. They didn't move closer, but they didn't meet. We tried to brush it off and continued hiking, but the mood had shifted. None of us felt as carefree as we had earlier. We were all hyper-aware of the person behind us, and it was starting to feel like we were being hunted. A couple of hours later, we reached the overlook. It was as stunning as we'd hoped, golden leaves stretching out for miles with the mountains rising in the distance, but none of us could fully enjoy it. The stranger was still there. They stayed on the trail, about 50 feet behind us, not moving any closer but also not leaving. It was unnerving. We tried to ignore them, taking photos and pretending to admire the view, but the tension was palpable. Eventually, one of my friends suggested that we head back to camp. The idea of spending more time with this person lurking nearby didn't sit well with anyone, so we started the hike back. This time, the stranger didn't follow us. They stayed at the overlook, standing completely still as we walked away. We tried to reassure ourselves that they'd just been a weird loner who liked to keep their distance. Maybe they weren't comfortable around groups or didn't want to make conversation. But the way they'd been so deliberate in keeping pace with us felt wrong. When we got back to camp, we noticed that things weren't quite the way we'd left them. One of the tents had been unzipped, and some of the food we'd left in a cooler was gone. Nothing else seemed to be missing, but the thought that someone had been there while we were away made us all uneasy. We decided to pack up and head out, cutting the trip short. As we were breaking down the tents, one of my friends found something in the dirt near the edge of the clearing, a boot print. It was large, much larger than any of ours, and it pointed toward the trail. It could have been from another hiker, but it looked fresh, like it had been made that day. The hike back to the trailhead was tense. None of us spoke much, and we kept glancing over our shoulders. Every rustle in the trees made us jump. When we finally reached the parking lot, we felt a wave of relief. But that relief was short-lived. Leaning against one of the cars was the stranger. They were still wearing the same black hoodie, and they didn't say a word. They just watched us as we loaded up our gear and got into the vehicles. We drove away as quickly as we could, and no one said anything until we were miles down the road. To this day, I have no idea who that person was or what they wanted. Maybe they were just a socially awkward hiker who didn't realize how creepy they were being. But the fact that they showed up at the parking lot, after we thought we'd left them behind, makes me think it wasn't that simple. I haven't been back to that trail since, and I'm not sure I ever will. Something about the way that person moved, the way they stayed just far enough to be out of reach but close enough to keep us on edge, felt calculated. It was a reminder that even in the middle of the woods, where you think you're escaping from the chaos of the world, danger can still find you. A few summers ago, I decided to go on a solo camping trip. It wasn't my first time camping alone, and I loved the peace that came with being in the woods without anyone around. Just me, my thoughts, and the quiet hum of nature. I chose a spot in a state park I'd been to before, but this time I planned to take a trail that wasn't as popular. It was a weekday, so I didn't expect to see many people. When I arrived at the trailhead and parked my car, there were only a couple of other vehicles in the lot. I grabbed my gear, locked up, and set off down the trail. The first few hours were perfect. The sun was warm but not too hot, the trail was shaded, and the sounds of the forest were all around me. I didn't pass a single person. I set up camp near a small creek and spent the rest of the day reading and exploring the area. As the sun began to set, I made a small fire to cook dinner. The light from the flames flickered against the trees, and I felt that familiar mix of excitement and calm that always comes with camping alone. It wasn't until I went to bed that I noticed something strange. I had just zipped myself into my sleeping bag and turned off my flashlight when I saw a faint glow in the distance. At first I thought it might be fireflies, but the light wasn't moving like fireflies do. It was steady and faint, like the beam of a flashlight from far away. I told myself it was probably just another camper setting up nearby. Even though I hadn't seen anyone all day, it wasn't impossible that someone had taken a different route to get to the area. Still, the fact that the light was so faint and far away made me feel uneasy. I tried to ignore it and close my eyes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself I was overthinking it, that the isolation was just getting to me, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me all night. When I woke up the next morning, the light was gone, and the forest felt normal again. Birds were chirping, the creek was bubbling, and the sun filtered through the trees. I convinced myself that whatever I'd seen the night before didn't matter. Maybe it really had been another camper who'd moved on. I spent the day hiking further into the woods, feeling more relaxed as the hours went by. But as the sun started to dip below the horizon, that sense of unease crept back in. I returned to my campsite, started another fire, and cooked dinner. This time I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt quieter than usual, like even the animals had decided to leave. As I sat by the fire, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. When I turned my head, I saw the faint glow of a flashlight again. It was closer this time, maybe 50 yards away, and it was moving slowly through the trees. I froze, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to call out to ask if someone was there, but another part of me was terrified to draw attention to myself. The light stopped moving and stayed in one spot, just barely visible through the trees. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe someone was out for a late hike and had wandered close to my camp. But the longer the light stayed there, the harder it was to believe that. Eventually I decided to go into my tent and pretend I didn't see anything. I zipped myself in, turned off my lantern, and lay as still as I could. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, and every rustle of leaves outside made me flinch. Hours went by and I didn't hear any footsteps or voices. I thought maybe the person had left, but when I peeked through the small mesh window of my tent, the light was still there. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up to the sound of snapping twigs. It wasn't loud, but it was close, like someone was walking just outside my camp. I held my breath, trying to listen for any other sounds. There was nothing, just the occasional snap of a branch and the distant hum of the creek. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers and everything looked normal. There was no sign of anyone else, no footprints, no trampled grass, nothing to suggest that someone had been there. But then I saw it. On the ground near the edge of my campsite was a small pile of stones stacked on top of each other. It wasn't there the day before, and it definitely wasn't something I'd done. My stomach dropped. The stones felt like a message, but I had no idea what it meant or who had left it. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started hiking back toward the trailhead. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the trail was empty. When I reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. The other vehicles I'd seen when I arrived were gone. I got in, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. To this day, I don't know who left that pile of stones or why they were watching me with a flashlight in the middle of the night. Maybe it was harmless, a curious hiker who didn't realize how creepy they were being. But the fact that they never said anything, never approached, and left no trace except for those stones makes me think it wasn't innocent. I haven't gone camping alone since. The woods don't feel the same to me anymore. What used to be a place of peace and solitude now feels like a place where I'm vulnerable, where someone could be watching me without me even knowing. I still think about that trip sometimes, wondering who that person was and what they wanted. Did they just want to scare me? Were they waiting for me to fall asleep? Whatever their intentions were, I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. Camping had always been a family tradition for me. My dad loved the outdoors, and as a kid, I spent countless weekends hiking and camping in the mountains. As an adult, I carried on the tradition with my friends, but this particular trip turned into something I'll never forget, and not in a good way. It was a long weekend, and 3 of us decided to head out to a remote campsite in the woods. We wanted to avoid crowded campgrounds, so we chose a spot that required a 4-mile hike to reach. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing near a small lake that we'd heard about from a friend. The hike-in was uneventful, and we arrived in the late afternoon. The spot was perfect flat ground, a view of the lake, and plenty of trees for shade. We set up our tents, built a fire pit, and spent the evening cooking hot dogs and marshmallows. The forest was quiet, and aside from the occasional splash of a fish in the lake, we didn't hear a thing. That first night, everything felt normal. We stayed up late talking, laughing, and stargazing before finally crawling into our tents. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the sound of crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound, something ripping or tearing. At first, I thought it might be an animal messing with one of our backpacks. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, and the campsite was mostly dark, but I didn't see anything unusual. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or a porcupine, and went back to sleep. The next morning, we noticed something odd. One of my friend's tents had a long, jagged tear along the side. It wasn't huge, maybe 6 or 7 inches, but it was enough to make us pause. My friend Eric swore he hadn't done it and said he hadn't heard anything during the night. We inspected the tear and couldn't decide what had caused it. It didn't look like an animal scratch, it was too clean for that, but it also didn't look like something a person would do intentionally. We brushed it off as bad luck, patched up the tent with duct tape, and went about our day. We spent the morning fishing and the afternoon hiking along the lake. By the time we got back to camp, we were all tired but in good spirits. That night, we sat around the fire again, telling stories and enjoying the peace and quiet. The forest felt different, though quieter than the night before. The crickets were silent, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. When it was time to turn in, I felt uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I didn't want to ruin the trip for everyone else, so I kept it to myself. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent and listening for any unusual sounds. For a while it was silent. Then I heard it again, that same ripping sound. This time it was closer. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound wasn't coming from my tent, but it was nearby. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, but I didn't unzip my tent. Instead, I listened, hoping the sound would stop. It didn't. The ripping noise was followed by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Someone or something was walking around our campsite. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps circled my tent, then moved toward Eric's. I heard the unmistakable sound of fabric tearing again. At that point, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I called out to my friends, asking if they were awake. Eric responded groggily, and I told him someone was outside. The footsteps stopped. Eric grabbed his flashlight and unzipped his tent, shining the beam outside. I did the same, and so did our other friend Sarah. The three of us stepped out of our tents, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. No one was there. We stood in the middle of the campsite, shining our lights in every direction. The fire was out, and the forest was pitch black. We didn't see or hear anything, but when we looked at Eric's tent, we saw another long, jagged tear, this one much bigger than the first. Panic started to set in. We debated what to do. Hiking out in the middle of the night didn't seem safe, but staying at the campsite felt even worse. We decided to pack up our gear and leave. We worked quickly, keeping our flashlights on and staying close together. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made us jump, but we didn't see anyone or anything. The hike back to the car was the longest 4 miles of my life. We kept looking over our shoulders, convinced that someone or something was following us. The forest felt alive, like it was watching us, waiting for us to slip up. When we finally reached the parking lot, we were relieved to see that our car was still there and untouched. We threw our gear in the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. Driving away, none of us said a word. The silence in the car was heavy, and I think we were all trying to process what had just happened. To this day, I don't know who or what was responsible for those torn tents. Part of me thinks it was just a prankster trying to scare us, but the fact that we never saw anyone makes me wonder. If it was a person, why didn't they confront us? Why didn't they try to take anything? And if it wasn't a person, well, I try not to think about that too much. I haven't been back to that spot since, and I don't think I ever will. Camping used to be something I loved, but now it feels like an invitation for trouble. The woods aren't as peaceful as they used to be, and I can't shake the feeling that some dangers are better left unexplored. If you're ever out in the middle of nowhere and you hear something strange, don't brush it off like I did. Pay attention to those uneasy feelings. Sometimes they're the only warning you'll get. There was something.